Anime villains who were right. Who comes to mind when you hear those words? Is it a character that wants nothing but destruction for the world simply because of his own hatred? Or is it a character who wants to create something new based on his own brutal experiences of life? Do you visualize a character whose motives are justified? Or do you visualize a character who wants nothing more than to destroy the entire world because he opened up TikTok? I think I agree with the latter guy, I'm not gonna lie. Don't worry bro, you're not the only one who thinks Thanos is low-key right after seeing what's going on in the world today. Let's be honest bro, you can't tell me that Light Yagami wasn't doing some deal of good by killing off criminals, or that Pain wasn't completely right about Pain. Yes, it's true, generally the villain of a story is made out to have a goal that is usually undesirable for most of the viewers, but there are also some times where a justifiable purpose for the villain makes them more compelling and allows the viewer to see the parallels with the protagonist. I mean, there are some stories where it's hard to tell who the protagonist counterpart even is because you don't know whose goal is really the evil one. And that's the interesting thing. Does it always have to be inherently evil, or can it be evil for the sake of good? What even is evil? That was hypothetical, but if you want a real answer, you can skip to this timestamp. First and foremost, we should establish that a villain and an antagonist are not the same, because I see this everywhere. It gets mixed up a lot. Antagonist, villain. They're not really the same thing, because an antagonist is someone who opposes the protagonist. Therefore, a character cannot be the protagonist and the antagonist at the same time. However, a villain is a character who does villainous acts, whatever that may be in the context of the story. So whatever villainous acts the character does, if they are the protagonist, they cannot be the antagonist. The antagonist can be a good guy as long as they are directly opposing the protagonist. They're complete opposites of each other in the context of the stories that they are written. It's not just the antagonist is evil, the protagonist is good, or vice versa. It has to be the protagonist with whatever goal, and the antagonist is the character or characters that oppose that protagonist. Let's take the example I'm probably going to use so many times in this video, Attack on Titan. Eren is the protagonist. Crunchyroll is literally called Eren Antagonist of the Year at some point, which is complete bullshit because he cannot be the protagonist and the antagonist at the same time. He's the protagonist, he becomes the villain later on, but the antagonist is the one that is antagonizing his goal, going against his goal, which at that time is the Alliance, his friends, all those guys. They're the antagonists at that point of the story. It's hard to put into perspective and actually comprehend because you're so used to thinking that the good people are the protagonists, whereas in this case, the good people are actually the antagonists. The same thing goes for Death Note. If you look at Light Yagami and his goals, they kind of seem evil, they kind of seem good. Again, it's that whole evil versus good debate. But L obviously works for the police force. He works for people who are morally considered good. However, he's the antagonist of the story because he goes against Light's goals, and Light is the protagonist despite being the villain. Now, these examples of parallels that I've just given between the villain and the hero are present in many stories, but I'll again go to Attack on Titan because I think between Reiner and Eren, these two characters, I think it's shown probably one of the best, at least in terms of what I'm trying to explain. At the beginning of the story, Reiner is the one that's framed as the villain, whereas Eren becomes the villain towards the end of the story. The reason for this change is partly due to the characters, but it's mainly due to the change in the perspective that we have as the reader. Think about it. If you look at Eren's temperament from the beginning of the story versus the end of the story, it's not really all that different. It's just that the perspective in the context of the story has changed. We're not now going completely against the Titans. In fact, it's kind of the opposite. We're going against humans who are responsible for bringing the Titans onto the island that we kind of grew up with the protagonists through watching the show. Eren's temperament at the beginning of the story was kind of this reckless child who also had the ambition to kill all of the Titans. It's just that the reason he ends up choosing the rumbling in the end is because his perspective changes due to what he experiences throughout his life and due to the reality of the world that he later understands. So when you really think about it, his choice to make the rumbling makes a lot of sense. Even if he hadn't gone through all of this development, it still kind of would have made sense given the information that we have at the end of the story. I mean, you can't tell me that he just turns into a genocidal maniac towards the end of the story because he always had that in him. It was just directed towards Titans, not humans. So we kind of don't see it, but it is there within his character. And that's a perfect way to write a character where his temperament matches where he needs to be towards the end of the story. I guess I'm specifically talking about villains here. Their temperament at the beginning has to kind of match their goals towards the end so that they can undergo that development and become that character at the end of the story. The idea of perspective that I just talked about is huge when we want to analyze the purpose of a villain and what makes their motives justifiable. Eren randomly trampling civilians seems immoral from a general perspective, but when the acts of those same people towards him are taken into account, it's no wonder why half the fanbase supported the rumbling. The viewer, who is you, interprets these changes in perspective through Eren's point of view, so you kind of grow into the same position as him, well, at least in the context of the story. You grow to hating the humans on the other side, so his actions are kind of justified, even though he's the villain and he's doing immoral actions, at least generally considered immoral actions. But again, it's in the context of the story, so it's kind of difficult to call it immoral considering what Eren went through and what the people who he's now attacking have done to him. This idea of having the same point of view as the main character is only really applicable if they're the main character, which in Eren's case he is, but it can work with an antagonist as long as the antagonist has their own sort of perspective throughout the story. So like we can even apply this to Reiner because he had his own perspective throughout the story. Even though he was the antagonist for a large part of it, we still kind of grew to understand him as a character, and that's kind of why we could feel the desires of both sides in Attack on Titan, and where for at least some people it wasn't all Team Eren or Team Reiner. It was kind of conflicted between the two because we've had quite a bit of perspective from both sides, so we understand the villainous motives of both of these characters, even though again in the context of their story it's kind of hard to consider it villainous. Apply the same concept to Reiner and it makes even more sense. He seems like a villain whose motives aren't justifiable, but that serves as a contrast for Eren, which is the initial spark to their two sides of the same coin dynamic. It's no wonder why throughout the story Reiner goes from a seemingly heartless titan to a hero who never seems to fail at fumbling the bag. There are villains who literally just want to watch the world burn, and then there are villains who want to burn the world for a good reason, at least one that is justifiable given what they've been through. But what's interesting about these villains is that all of their goals are hard to define as evil because in some cases tyranny was really the only option. I'm getting at another Eren example because if you know Attack on Titan, you know that Eren kinda had no option. Bro, he's not going to euthanize all Eldians. That's just stupid. It's true that at the end of the story, Eren's actions are considered villain-like because, I mean, the dude has probably the greatest death count in anime history and probably the smallest body count. What he does towards the end is hard to justify, but it makes sense considering his circumstances. Can you call him evil if this was pretty much the only choice that he had? If your argument is that he could have gone through with the euthanasia or the half rumbling, then I ask you, are either of those evil? Because if you think about castrating an entire race, that's pretty much removing the freedom of everyone in that race, and doing a half rumbling leads to your own people dying in the future. So what really is the true right choice, especially in a timeline that's deterministic like Attack on Titan? It's hard to answer that question, and there may not really be a correct answer to that question because there might not really be a right choice, or there might not be a choice in the first place. This is why in certain contexts a villain's motives can be inherently evil, while at the same time they're kind of right for doing what they did, because we would probably do the same thing if we were in their position. Now let's get on to evil, because this is a very interesting argument. Do you know what evil even means? Because I certainly don't. Because when you dictionary the word evil, it gives you probably the most pathetic and useless answer possible. Profoundly immoral and wicked. And then if you're a dumbass like me, you search up what immoral means, and you get nowhere again. At the end of the day, when you dig deeper into the nature of evil, you'll enter a gray area, one that looks like Marley after Eren stomped them. But you get the idea. If we go along with these definitions, it's true that what characters like Eren, Pain, and Light Yagami did were immoral and wrong in every sense, but is it true evil if the desired outcome is in some ways moral? Because you can't tell me that some of you wouldn't do what Light did if you got the Death Note. Because to me, what he did seemed moral in many ways, aside from the fact that he was taking human life. But I mean, he was getting rid of the lives of people who were taking the lives of innocents. And so I pose another difficult question. Is it immoral to take the life of an immoral person to save others? As I said, this topic is essentially a bottomless pit, but what you'll notice is that not all villain desires are inherently villainous. It's just that because of human nature, attaining peace requires its adversary evil. The yin-yang displays this perfectly. Everyone can be born with good intentions, but it's because of the world that the small evil inherent from birth grows into a vicious desire so malevolent that the world ends up getting flattened. You either die the hero or live long enough to become the villain can be applied to these three characters I spoke of in how they lived longer than most and saw more than most which is what led them down this path. I guess you can kind of exclude Light Yagami from this last part, because he didn't really see more than most necessarily. There are also people who were given unique powers that further pushed them to make use of it for the sake of peace. But the common denominator of that peace was some kind of evil. Eren's abilities were special in that he could see the future and throughout the story understood the reality of the world. Light Yagami was handed a notebook that was godlike and he kind of couldn't resist. Pain had the Rinnegan and endured nothing but literal pain. Knut, even though he's not as evil as the aforementioned, became king but was forced to use malevolent tactics to defeat his malevolent adversaries. The bottom line of these villains is that they embody the idea that to fight evil and bring about peace, you must become evil. To bring light, there must first be dark. To bring order, there must first be chaos. And to bring peace, there must first be evil. What's important for these villains is that they have genuine counterparts, not just in battle but in ideology. And both beliefs must make sense given the context and must tie into each other. Sometimes the adversary is a person and sometimes it can be the entire world. But whether the villain is a peace-seeking demon or a genocidal virgin doesn't matter if the desire of said villain doesn't make sense for his or her character, and likewise, although less so, the desire of their counterpart. There are many ways to write a counterpart. You could have two characters who chase two completely different goals that conflict, say like Ichigo and Aizen. One wants to change the world and the other wants to keep it the way it is. Then you could have counterparts who desire the same outcome but seek it in alternative ways. Pretty much every other example I can give is like this. Thorfinn and Canute both want peace, but Thorfinn chases it through peace and Canute through any means necessary, including evil. In the case of the villain against the world, Eren and the Alliance share a desire for freedom without racism and oppression, though obviously he follows it through in a completely different way. But again, that's kind of because he's seen more than everyone else and he kind of has certain abilities that other people don't have. So how do we know that someone like Armin or Levi or Erwin in his situation wouldn't have done the same thing? But they're not really villainous people. That's the thing though. Evil is inherent in every character, so it's hard to really define a villain as a true villain. To circle back to the topic of evil, it all depends on the story's context, setting, and direction. If a villain is written well enough, this fragile idea of evil can be twisted in a way where a ridiculous ideology can seem justifiable, again in the context of the story. My favorite example of a villainous belief being portrayed perfectly is through the character of Johann Liebert. My man made it through the thumbnail, although he's not getting talked about as much. Johann's ideology suggests that humans are equal only in death, suggesting that by killing others, he's actually equalizing them and creating some type of order from chaos. It may seem a little ridiculous without context, but this connects to Tenma, the protagonist's belief that humans are equal in life. It's that connection between protagonist and antagonist that enhances the antagonist's impact on the story and sort of makes their motive seems somewhat justifiable. This distinction, as well as how the idea of death ties into Johann and follows him around the story, makes for what is, in my opinion, one of storytelling's finest masterminds. Now, let's talk about what it takes to actually become a villain. First things first is the character's temperament. I briefly mentioned this earlier in the video, but the way the character is by nature dictates how they will change to the circumstances placed upon them by the world. For example, a nice guy character with almost no anger-driven motives like Tanjiro won't undergo the kind of development that a character like Eren does, even if he was in the same story. Eren goes through his development because he shares inherent characteristics to the demon he later becomes. In other words, he was sort of already born kind of like a demon. It's just that the world completely twisted that upside down and pushed him so far into that direction that he kind of had no choice. It's often not considered how important the nature and temperament of the character who's going through their villain arc is. It depends on the world, but also the victim of that world and who they are from start to end, how they fit into the world and how the world impacts them. All these things matter, and it's so nuanced when it comes to building a character from his original temperament to his kind of final form as the villain. Next is the events of the villain's transformations. What leads to him having a unique viewpoint, so he's just one big bad character whose view on the world is a little bit different, or at least their way of approaching things is a lot different from the other characters in the story, primarily their adversary, either the protagonist or the antagonist. I've seen this done in multiple ways where the villain has had experiences similar to other characters but is driven down another path because of temperament and personal goals that they possess. This is evident with villains from Naruto, with Pain and Obito being primary examples, considering how both of them faced a loss or many losses that are somewhat similar to what other characters experience, but because of their temperament and perspective on these events, they go down the dark path. If Naruto underwent these events that, for example, Obito or Pain went through, he wouldn't completely go down the path of evil because that's just not in his nature. If Obito or Nagato lived Naruto's life, then who knows, they probably would have gone down the path of evil regardless, because it's part of their temperament. Next is the goal. It must fit the protagonist in a way as well as the world. By protagonist, I mean the adversary, so either protagonist or antagonist depending on who the villain is. There's no need to spend too long on this section because everyone knows that a villain's goal is the opposite of the hero's, but it can be the goal itself that is opposite, or it can be the way in which the goal is reached that is opposite. So to give you two examples, Ichigo and Aizen, two completely different characters, two completely different goals. Canute and Thorfinn, two very similar goals, but two completely different ways of approaching them. And lastly is the conclusion. The villain almost never wins, so the loss has to somewhat be justified and fit as the final means of development and a justifiable conclusion. And here we go, Eren fans in the comments are going to go off, but all too often, the villain does get an undeserving ending because their ambitions and powers are taken too far. I'm talking about two specific stories here. The villain can conclude as Lelouch, Eren, or Itachi did, having had moral desires from the beginning, but having gone through the process of evil to reach that desire. Or they can have the desires questioned and altered like Pain and Obito and kind of go down a different path right towards the end of their character arc. Basically, I mean talk no jutsu. So all of this leads me to my final concluding details and decisions about which villains were right in their desires. Let's first get out of the way that there is no right or wrong when you literally have no other choice, like Eren, for example. But definitively, I'd consider a villain's motive quote-unquote right, which that's very difficult to define, if their temperament makes sense relative to their development, if their intentions are moral, and if they fit in with the direction of the story and the supporting characters. I was gonna make this a goofy video where I memed around it, but I put some effort into it and prevented it from being a total shitpost, so I hope you liked it. Now let me know your thoughts, and if this video gets 1,000 likes, I'll make anime villains who were wrong. Guess who's gonna be in that one?